There is a moment in every great city's life when you stop seeing what it is and start seeing what it used to be. You walk the same streets, you pass the same monuments, but something in the air has shifted. The grandeur is still there, framed in marble and ancient stone, but underneath it, something is quietly rotting. Rome is having that moment right now. For 2,000 years, this city was the center of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. Every road led here. Every empire measured itself against what Rome had built. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum. Monuments so large, so enduring, that medieval Europeans assumed they had been built by giants, because no human civilization they knew could have produced them. And for centuries, the world came to Rome not just to see ruins, but to witness the living proof that human ambition could produce something eternal. Today, Rome receives more than 30 million visitors a year. The tourism numbers are staggering. The marketing is flawless. And if you only read the headlines, you would believe the eternal city has never been stronger. But spend more than a week here. Talk to the people who were born here, who built businesses here, who raised children here, and you will hear a different story. One of slow erosion, quiet collapse. A city that has become a museum of itself, preserved on the surface, hollowing out underneath. This is the story of how Rome fell once and how it is falling again. Not to barbarians this time, to something quieter, something harder to fight. If you have ever wondered why the world's most historically significant cities sometimes feel like stage sets rather than living places, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media prefers not to see. We document the collapse in real time, before the world catches on. Let us begin where Rome always begins, with the myth. The Roman Empire, at its peak, governed territory stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. At the height of the Antonine era, in the 2nd century AD, Rome's population reached somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, making it the largest city on Earth by a significant margin. It was a city of running water, underfloor heating, a postal system, public libraries, and a legal code sophisticated enough that modern constitutional democracies still borrow from it. The infrastructure Romans built endured so completely that some of their roads, their aqueducts, their bridges are still in use today, 2,000 years later. But here is the first pattern. And it is the pattern that every empire forgets, because it is most visible in retrospect. Rome's greatest achievements were also Rome's earliest warnings. The scale of the infrastructure required to maintain Roman civilization was so enormous, so complex, so interdependent, that the moment the system began to strain, the decline accelerated faster than anyone predicted. The aqueducts that fed the city required constant maintenance. The grain supply that fed the population required control of North Africa and Egypt. The roads that connected the empire required a standing army capable of securing every mile of them. Rome was not just a city, it was a machine. And machines of that complexity do not age gracefully. The Western Empire fell officially in 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But historians will tell you, the fall did not begin in 476. It began 2, perhaps 3 centuries earlier, in the gradual debasement of the currency, in the contracting of tax revenues, in the plague years that emptied the countryside, in the military stretched across too many frontiers, in the political paralysis at the center, where emperors rose and fell with such speed that in the 3rd century alone, Rome cycled through more than 20 rulers in 50 years. The fall of Rome was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow, incremental, almost imperceptible erosion, until it wasn't. Until the last emperor sat on a throne that meant nothing in a city that no longer controlled anything, and a chieftain decided it simply was not worth keeping the fiction alive any longer. That pattern is the thing. Because modern Rome is not immune to it. The Rome that exists today governs a population of roughly 2.8 million people in the city proper. It is the capital of Italy, the 4th largest economy in the Eurozone. It has some of the most visited cultural sites in human history. And it is, by almost every metric that matters for a functioning modern city, failing its own residents in ways that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago. The infrastructure of modern Rome, unlike the infrastructure the Romans themselves built, is crumbling. The metro system, one of the smallest of any major European capital relative to the city's size, has been plagued by closures, flooding, and delays for years. The reason the metro is so limited is partly financial and partly archaeological. You cannot dig anywhere in Rome without hitting something ancient: a buried necropolis, an intact mosaic floor, a section of an aqueduct. Every time construction crews attempt to expand the underground network, they discover something that stops work for months or years. The city is, in a literal sense, built on top of itself. Layer upon layer of history, and the weight of that history makes modern infrastructure almost impossible to build. The roads above ground are not in better condition. Rome's streets are famous among residents for their potholes, some of which have caused serious accidents and at least one documented fatality in recent years. The city's maintenance budget is consistently insufficient. The historic center's cobblestones, beautiful to photograph, are treacherous to drive on, impossible to cycle on safely, and structurally inadequate for the volume of heavy tourist buses that now traverse them daily. Garbage collection has been a recurring civic crisis. In 2018 and again in 2020, photographs of Rome's streets piled with uncollected waste went viral internationally, not in the periphery but in the center, near the Colosseum. Near the Trevi Fountain, the Municipal Waste Management Company, AMA, has been mired in debt, mismanagement, and labor disputes for years. The city's waste-to-energy infrastructure remains inadequate, and Rome ships significant amounts of its trash to other regions, including abroad, because it lacks the capacity to process its own output. A former urban planner who worked with the Rome municipality told a journalist in 2022 that the fundamental problem is not political will. It is institutional inertia so deep that even competent administrators cannot move fast enough to prevent decline. Every decision, he said, requires approvals from 6 different departments, each of which may have overlapping jurisdiction, and none of which has enough staff to process the requests in a reasonable time frame. It is bureaucracy as architecture, and it is built to last as long as the Pantheon. None of this is what the 30 million tourists see. They see the postcard. They see the Forum, lit golden, at dusk. They see the gelato, and the Aperol spritz, and the priests in cassocks moving through piazzas that look exactly as they did in photographs from 100 years ago. The marketing of Rome is flawless, because the marketing of Rome is the oldest, most practiced marketing operation in human history. This city has been selling itself since Augustus commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid. Selling the myth of Rome is what Rome does. It is what it has always done. The question is whether the myth can sustain a city when the infrastructure beneath it is collapsing. And this is where something darker enters the story. If you visit patterns like this fascinate you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to keep this kind of investigation alive. Rome's relationship with tourism has crossed a threshold in the last decade that cannot be uncrossed without serious, painful structural change. The city has not managed tourism. It has surrendered to it. Airbnb listings in Rome's historic center have exploded since 2015. By the early 2020s, some estimates placed Rome among the European capitals with the highest concentration of short-term rental properties in its central districts. The consequence is one that residents of Venice, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Lisbon have all encountered: the slow evacuation of actual inhabitants from the city center. When a landlord can earn more in 3 weeks from tourists than in 3 months from a long-term tenant, the economic logic is inescapable. Residents leave. Restaurants that served locals close, markets that served residents close, and in their place come more gelato stands, more selfie spots, more souvenir shops selling plastic colosseums manufactured in China. The Trastevere neighborhood, once a working-class Roman quarter with a specific character, a specific community, has been almost entirely colonized by this process. Long-term residents, families who had lived there for generations, describe the change with the particular exhaustion of people who have been losing a slow argument for years. It's not Trastevere anymore, one shopkeeper's daughter told a documentary crew in 2021. It's a theme park that used to be a neighborhood. The same process is visible in the Prati district, near the Vatican. In Pigneto, which was the next neighborhood over from gentrification a decade ago and is now fully in its grip, and even in the historic center itself, where residential population has declined steadily as the tourist infrastructure expands to fill every vacated apartment, every shuttered shop, what is being built in Rome right now is not a city. It is a hospitality complex with ancient monuments in it. And here is where the historical parallel becomes impossible to ignore, because Rome has been through a version of this before. Not in antiquity, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the papal court deliberately transformed the city into a pilgrimage destination, redirecting resources away from functional urban infrastructure and toward monumental religious architecture designed to impress visitors, the city's population stagnated. Commerce outside the pilgrimage economy withered. Rome became, for a century, something very close to what it is becoming again. A spectacular stage set sustained by the revenue of those passing through, not those living within. It recovered from that. The question is whether the political will and the institutional capacity exist to recover from this. The answer, based on the evidence available, is complicated at best. The broader economic picture of modern Rome is not encouraging. Italy's economy has been one of the weakest in the developed world by growth metrics for most of the last 3 decades. Rome's economy is particularly dependent on public sector employment, tourism, and culture. The private sector is thin. The startup ecosystem, while it exists and has produced some genuine successes, is dwarfed by Milan's. Young Romans with technical education and ambition disproportionately leave. Not just for other countries, but for Milan, which has increasingly captured the economic and cultural energy that a national capital should anchor. Milan is Italy's financial center, its fashion center, its media center, its design center. Rome is Italy's administrative center, its historical center, and increasingly, its tourist center. That divergence has been growing for decades. And it represents something historically familiar to anyone who has studied the late Roman Empire, when administrative capitals multiplied, when Constantinople eclipsed Rome in economic and political relevance, when the center ceased to be central and became ceremonial. The brain drain from Rome, particularly among professionals under 40, is not a theory. It is measurable. Italian national statistics consistently show net migration from Rome and southern regions toward Milan and northern Italy, and net migration from Italy as a whole toward Germany, the UK prior to Brexit, and increasingly, Portugal and Spain. The people who leave are disproportionately educated, multilingual, and ambitious. The people who remain are disproportionately older, public sector dependent, or unable to move. It is a demographic pattern that, in other contexts, and at larger scale, historians describe as the beginning of the end. What you have traced in this chapter? The crumbling infrastructure, the institutional paralysis, the hollowing out of neighborhoods by tourism, the quiet departure of young talent, the economic divergence from Milan, the city becoming a stage set of its own past, all of it is one face of a pattern that runs across every great city entering its long dusk. I assembled the early warning signals, the framework behind what happens when cities become their own monuments, the calm map of where human capital and ambition actually flow when a center ceases to center, into a guide called When Everything Falls. Scan the code on your screen right now, or find the link waiting in the description below. But do not leave yet, because the last pattern Rome shows us is the one that history will remember above all the others. It is the pattern that answers the oldest question in urban decline, not when a city starts to fall, but when it decides to stop fighting. Rome has decided many things in its history. It decided to build an empire. It decided to build a church to replace it. It decided to become a republic, a fascist state, a democracy. Each decision was made in the shadow of everything that came before, which is both Rome's greatest strength and its most paralyzing burden. The psychic weight of 2,000 years of history is not an abstraction when you live inside it. Romans have a word, Romanita, that roughly translates as Romanness, an identity so ancient and so layered that it becomes simultaneously a source of immense pride and a reason not to change. Why innovate when you invented the arch? Why reform when you created the law? The grandeur of the Roman past is not just decorative, it is load-bearing. and it bears down on every attempt at transformation. There is a particular kind of civic paralysis that only very old cities develop. The paralysis of cultures, so conscious of their own significance that the preservation of that significance becomes more important than the function of the present. Athens has it. Cairo has it. Istanbul has it. And Rome has it in the most concentrated, most historically reinforced form of any city on earth. The monuments cannot be moved. The institutions cannot be relocated. The mythology cannot be revised. And so, the city moves around them, accommodating them, sacrificing its present infrastructure for the upkeep of its past identity. This is not a criticism, it is an observation, and it is, in its own way, magnificent. There is something genuinely moving about a city that takes its past this seriously. But it is also, as a model for civic governance in the 21st century, deeply inadequate. The data suggests that Rome's tourism-dependent economy is also more fragile than it appears. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Rome's economy contracted sharply, with estimates placing the GDP decline in the city at somewhere between 8 and 12% in 2020 alone. A city whose revenue base is so concentrated in foot traffic from international visitors is a city with significant structural vulnerability to any disruption in that traffic, whether pandemic, geopolitical, climate-related, or simply competitive. As other destinations improve their offerings and capture market share, Venice has faced this reckoning more acutely and more visibly than Rome. But the underlying dynamics are similar. A city whose resident population has been hollowing out for decades, whose economy is almost entirely tourism-dependent, whose infrastructure serves visitors rather than residents, whose young people leave as fast as they arrive, is not a city in the traditional sense. It is an attraction. And attractions, however spectacular, are fragile. The question Rome faces, the question its residents debate in bars and parliament and university seminar rooms, is whether a city can survive its own mythological weight. Whether it is possible to be simultaneously the most historically significant urban space in the Western world and a functional, livable, forward-looking 21st century city, or whether those two things are ultimately incompatible. Whether the eternal city is eternal not because it endures in the sense of thriving, but because it endures in the sense of a ruin, still standing, extraordinary to behold, no longer entirely alive. The Roman Empire's fall was not a single event. It was a series of capitulations, each one individually manageable, collectively catastrophic. The debasement of the currency was manageable, until inflation made the army unaffordable. The contraction of the frontier was reasonable, until the frontier was inside Italy. The political instability was tolerable, until there was no political structure left capable of making hard decisions. And each generation of Romans that lived through those capitulations looked at the monuments around them, at the Colosseum and the Forum and the Pantheon, and believed that what those monuments represented could not truly be finished, could not truly be over. The buildings were too large, the history too long, the myth too powerful. They were wrong. The myth was not power. The myth was the last thing that remained when the power was gone. Modern Rome is not the Western Roman Empire. Its situation is not that terminal. The comparison is not meant to prophesy collapse, but to illuminate pattern. The pattern of a city that has begun to live more on its reputation than on its vitality. That has become more invested in presenting its past than in building its future. That has allowed its most capable residents to leave without creating sufficient reason to stay. That has traded the complexity of being a real city for the simplicity of being an image of itself. That pattern, wherever it appears in history, ends one of two ways. Either the city finds a painful, disruptive, politically costly way to reinvent itself, which requires a generation of hard choices, or it continues the slow slide toward becoming something between a monument and a museum, magnificent and melancholy, visited by everyone and inhabited by fewer and fewer people who remember what it felt like when it was fully alive. Rome has made that choice before. It has come back from things far worse than this. It survived sacking by the Visigoths in 410. It survived the Black Death. It survived the sack of Rome in 1527, when the army of Charles V reduced the city to a fraction of its population in a matter of weeks. Each time, Rome rebuilt. Each time, the myth proved strong enough to attract the people, the resources, and the ambition necessary to restore some version of vitality. But every one of those recoveries began with a moment of recognition. A moment when the Romans stopped looking at what they had been and looked, clearly and without sentimentality, at what they were. That moment of recognition is the hardest thing for any great city to achieve. It requires a willingness to admit that grandeur and functionality are not the same thing. That a monument to the past and a home for the future require different things from those who govern them. Whether Rome is ready for that moment is not a question this chapter can answer. It is a question the Romans themselves are beginning to ask. You can hear it in the conversations between the history, in the voices of the architects and the urban planners, and the young entrepreneurs who stayed when they could have left. In the frustration of residents who love this city with a specificity that only comes from belonging to a place that shaped you completely, they are asking whether Rome can be saved from its own history. Whether the weight of 2,000 years of greatness can be turned from a burden into a foundation. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. And recognizing the pattern is not the same as being powerless against it. Rome taught the world that lesson first. It would be something, wouldn't it, if Rome learned it again? If you want to watch the next chapter before the rest of the world notices, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that history will remember, and we are just getting started. Tell us in the comments which city you think falls next. The next chapter is already loading.